The moment I realized the HOA president had been driving across my farm for months, I knew this was not just a misunderstanding. Someone had convinced her that my land belonged to everyone. My name is Ethan Walker, and I have owned my farm for years. It is not a large commercial property. It is a quiet piece of land where I spend my time maintaining the fields, caring for the property, and enjoying the privacy that comes with owning rural land. That changed when I noticed tire tracks appearing near the edge of my property. At first, I assumed someone had made a wrong turn. Then I saw the same vehicle again. It was Melissa Carter, the HOA president from the nearby neighborhood. She was driving across a section of my farm that connected to a path near the community. I approached her calmly and asked if there was a reason she was using my property. She looked surprised that I even asked. She explained that the route had been used by residents for years and that the HOA considered it a convenient access point. Her confidence caught my attention. She did not sound like someone asking for permission. She sounded like someone who believed permission was unnecessary. I did not argue with her. Instead, I decided to check the facts. I knew property boundaries could be complicated, and I wanted to understand exactly what rights existed. I went through my records, looked at my survey documents, and searched for any agreement that allowed another party to use the land. What I found was strange. There was no obvious easement, no signed agreement, and no document showing that the HOA had permission to cross my farm. That discovery raised a bigger question. If the HOA did not own the road and did not have written permission, why was Melissa so certain she could use it? I decided to look deeper into the history of the property. I found old maps showing the farm boundary, but they did not match the assumptions the HOA seemed to be making. The path existed, but a path on the ground did not automatically mean it was a public road. It belonged to someone. The more I researched, the more I realized this was not only about one vehicle crossing my land. It was about a belief that had spread through the community without anyone checking the facts. Then I discovered something that changed the entire situation. The HOA was planning its biggest neighborhood event of the year, and according to their announcements, they intended to use that same route for hundreds of guests. Suddenly, this was no longer a small issue between two people. A decision was coming that could affect the entire community. And before that event arrived, I needed to find out who originally told the HOA they had the right to use my farm. The first thing I did after finding the missing permission was look for the source of the confusion. I knew Melissa Carter was not randomly driving across my farm. She believed she had a reason. The question was who gave her that information and whether it was ever based on actual property records. I started by reviewing every document connected to my land. I checked the original survey, county records, and any references to shared access. The more I looked, the clearer one thing became. The road on my property had always existed, but its existence did not automatically give anyone the right to use it. A path can be visible for decades and still belong to a private owner. That was the detail everyone seemed to overlook. I decided to visit the county records office and search for anything connected to the nearby neighborhood. I wanted to find the exact moment when the HOA began treating my farm road like a community route. After several hours of searching, I found something unexpected. There was a map used during the neighborhood development process that showed a connection between the community and the area near my property. But the map did not include any legal agreement granting access through my land. It was only a planning document. That difference explained a lot. Someone had looked at a development map and assumed it represented legal rights. But a planning map and a property agreement are not the same thing. When I returned home, I reviewed the security footage again. I counted how often Melissa and other vehicles had crossed the property. It was not a single mistake. It had become a routine. That discovery made the situation more serious because the HOA was not preparing to use my land once. They were planning to expand that use during their upcoming community event. The event was only a few weeks away, and the announcements had already been made. Residents were expecting easy access, and the HOA had already included the route in their plans. I knew I needed to speak with Melissa again, but this time I wanted to bring facts instead of questions. When I met with her, I showed her the records I had found. She looked carefully at the documents, and explained that the HOA had always believed the road was available because previous residents had used it. She admitted that nobody on the board had personally reviewed the original property records. That answer revealed the first major weakness in their argument. The HOA had not confirmed ownership. They had simply continued a tradition. But traditions do not replace legal agreements. Before leaving the meeting, Melissa told me there was one person who might know how the road became connected to the neighborhood plans. It was a former HOA board member who helped organize the original development years earlier. I wrote down the name and decided to find that person. Because if someone had created this misunderstanding, I needed to know what they knew before the community event arrived. I expected the former HOA board member to explain why the community believed they had access to my farm road. What I did not expect was to discover that the entire issue started with a misunderstanding that had been repeated for years. His name was Robert Mitchell, and he had been involved with the neighborhood during its early development. When I met with him, I brought the same records I had shown Melissa Carter. I wanted answers, not an argument. Robert looked through the documents carefully and admitted that the road had always been discussed as a convenient connection point for the neighborhood. But then he revealed something important. When the community was first planned, the developers had considered creating an official access route through that area, but the agreement was never completed. The idea existed, but the legal permission did not. That single detail changed everything. The HOA had not inherited a legal right. They had inherited an old assumption. Over time, residents used the path, board members heard about it, and eventually people started treating it like it belonged to the community. But nobody had gone back to verify the original paperwork. I returned home with a clearer picture of what happened, but another problem remained. The HOA event was getting closer, and Melissa was still planning to use the route across my farm. I knew I needed to act carefully. If I simply blocked the road or created a public dispute, the situation could become more complicated. Instead, I decided to document everything and make sure the facts were clear before the event arrived. I installed additional cameras along the property boundary and organized all the records I had collected. My goal was not to embarrass anyone. My goal was to protect my property and prevent a bigger problem later. When Melissa learned that the original access agreement had never existed, her confidence changed. She explained that she had always believed the HOA had inherited the right from previous community leaders. For the first time, she started asking questions instead of defending the assumption. But then she showed me something unexpected. The HOA had another document that they believed supported their position. It was not an easement, but it was a letter from a previous developer mentioning future access plans near my property. Melissa believed this letter proved the community had always intended to use the route. I looked at the document carefully. It confirmed that the road had been discussed, but it did not grant permission. It was another example of the same mistake. A plan had been confused with a legal agreement. The community event was now only days away, and the HOA had to decide whether to continue using a route they could not prove they owned. But before anyone made a final decision, I noticed one more detail in the old developer records. The person who created the original access proposal had written a note about another document that was supposed to be completed later. A document that nobody had ever found. And if that missing document existed, it could completely change what everyone believed about the road. The missing document became the most important clue in the entire situation. For years, everyone had believed the road across my farm was available because of a plan that was discussed long ago. But now there was a possibility that the one document that could prove the HOA's claim had never actually been completed. I knew I needed to find out the truth before the community event arrived. I contacted the county records office again and asked them to search for any unfinished agreements, access documents, or historical filings connected to the property. After several days, they found something unexpected. There was a reference to an access agreement in the developer's notes, but the final signed document was missing from the official records. The agreement had been discussed, drafted, and planned, but it was never legally recorded. That discovery explained why the confusion had continued for so long. The HOA was not using my farm road because they had a legal right. They were using it because everyone assumed the agreement had been completed. When I shared this information with Melissa Carter, she became much more cautious. She contacted the HOA board and asked them to pause their plans for the event route until the situation was reviewed. This was a major change from the beginning, when she believed the road was clearly available. For the first time, the HOA was treating the issue as a property rights question instead of a simple neighborhood tradition. But the timing created a new challenge. The community event was only a few days away. Residents had already made plans, vendors had been contacted, and the HOA had promoted the route as the easiest way for guests to reach the event area. Many people wondered why the situation had become complicated so close to the event. I understood their frustration, but I also knew that ignoring the problem would only create a larger issue later. I decided to prepare a complete timeline showing how the misunderstanding developed. I included the original property survey, county records, security footage, and the documents provided by the HOA. When everything was organized, one pattern became obvious. Every piece of information the HOA relied on was connected to plans and assumptions, but none of it showed actual permission to cross my property. Then another detail appeared. While reviewing the HOA meeting notes, I found a record from years earlier where a board member had raised concerns about private property boundaries. The question had been discussed before, but the issue was never fully resolved. That discovery changed the story again. It meant this was not just a recent misunderstanding. The warning signs had existed for years. Someone had noticed the problem, but nobody had followed through. The community event was now approaching, and Melissa had to make a decision. Would the HOA continue defending a road they could not prove they owned, or would they admit the mistake and find another solution? Then the county called with one final update. They had located an old survey attachment that might reveal exactly why the road was never transferred to the HOA in the first place. The old survey attachment from the county became the document that everyone had been waiting for. For weeks, the HOA believed the road across my farm belonged to the community because of old plans and years of repeated use. But when the county official opened the file, it revealed a detail that changed the entire situation. The original developer had considered creating an access route through the area, but the final property transfer never included that road. The plan existed only as an idea. It was never completed as a legal agreement. That single discovery explained why nobody could find the missing easement. There was nothing to find because it had never been created. The road had always remained part of my private property. I reviewed the document carefully because I wanted to be certain before sharing the information with anyone. The evidence was clear. The HOA had not been given permission to use the road. They had simply continued a practice that started from an unfinished plan. When I showed the records to Melissa Carter, she was quiet for a moment. She admitted that the HOA had relied on information passed down from previous boards instead of confirming the legal details themselves. She explained that every board member after the original development assumed the access route was already approved. But assumptions can survive for years without ever becoming facts. The community event was now only days away, and Melissa had to make a difficult decision. The HOA could continue with their original plan and risk creating a larger property dispute, or they could change the event arrangements and acknowledge that the road was not theirs to use. I could see that this was no longer about winning an argument. It was about correcting a mistake before it affected more people. The HOA board called an emergency meeting with residents to explain the situation. Many homeowners were surprised because they had always believed the road was part of the neighborhood. They had seen vehicles use it for years, so they assumed there was a legal right behind it. The meeting became a lesson about the difference between what people see and what documents actually prove. During the discussion, another important detail came up. A former board member had once suggested creating a formal agreement with me or previous property owners, but that conversation never moved forward. The idea had existed, but the paperwork was never completed. This explained why the confusion lasted so long. Everyone remembered the intention, but nobody verified the final result. After the meeting, Melissa approached me and admitted that the HOA should have reviewed the records before using the road for community purposes. She asked if there was a possible solution that could work for everyone. I appreciated that the conversation had changed. At the beginning, the HOA believed they had the right to use my property. Now, they were asking how to move forward respectfully. But before any agreement could be discussed, another discovery appeared. While reviewing the historical records, the county found a note showing that the original developer had considered a completely different access route years earlier. That raised a new question. If another route had always been planned, why did the HOA continue relying on my farm road instead? The discovery of the alternative access route changed the way everyone viewed the situation. Until that moment, the HOA believed my farm road was the only practical option for reaching the community event area. But the historical record showed something different. The original development plans had included another route that was supposed to serve the neighborhood. It was not completed, and over time, people simply started using my property instead. A temporary solution had quietly become a permanent habit. I knew this information was important, but I also knew that facts alone would not solve the problem. The HOA needed a realistic path forward. Melissa Carter scheduled another meeting with the board and invited me to explain the property records. This time, the conversation was completely different. There was no argument about whether the road belonged to the community. The documents had answered that question. Instead, everyone focused on how to correct the mistake without creating more confusion. I presented the original survey, the county records, the developer notes, and the information about the unfinished access plan. Each piece of evidence connected to the same conclusion. The HOA had made decisions based on assumptions that were never confirmed. The residents were surprised to learn how easily a misunderstanding could continue for years when nobody reviewed the official documents. Several homeowners admitted they had always believed the road was part of the neighborhood because they saw vehicles using it regularly. But seeing something happen does not always prove there is a legal right behind it. That became the biggest lesson from the entire situation. Melissa explained to the board that the HOA had to update its procedures. Future decisions involving property boundaries, shared access, or community projects would require proper verification before moving forward. The board agreed that relying on old memories and informal explanations had created the problem in the first place. The community event was adjusted, and the HOA found another arrangement that did not involve crossing my farm. For the first time in months, the pressure surrounding the road started to disappear. I appreciated that the situation was moving toward a solution instead of becoming a bigger conflict. But there was still one issue that needed to be addressed. The repeated use of my property had created a record of activity that could affect future discussions about access. I wanted to make sure the final agreement was clear and protected everyone involved. Melissa asked if I would consider creating a formal arrangement that would allow limited access under specific conditions. I told her I would only consider anything that respected ownership rights and followed the proper legal process. Before any decision could be made, the HOA board reviewed one final piece of information from the county. It was a note attached to the original development file that revealed why the planned access route was abandoned years earlier. The reason was not what anyone expected, and it explained why the neighborhood ended up relying on my farm road instead. The final note from the original development file explained why the neighborhood never completed the planned access route, and it revealed a detail that changed how everyone understood the situation. The alternative route was not abandoned because the developers forgot about it. It was delayed because the original plan required additional approvals and adjustments that were never completed. Instead of finishing that process, later community leaders relied on the existing path across my farm because it was already there. Over time, a temporary shortcut became something people treated as permanent. That discovery helped everyone understand how the mistake grew. It was not caused by one single decision. It was a series of assumptions passed from one person to another without anyone checking the official records. After the HOA board reviewed the information, Melissa Carter proposed creating a clear solution that respected both the community and my property rights. She admitted that the HOA should have verified the access situation years earlier. I appreciated that change because the goal was never to create a problem for the neighborhood. I simply wanted my ownership rights to be recognized. The board began discussing options for the future. They could continue searching for a legal access solution elsewhere, or they could explore a formal agreement with me that clearly defined any possible use of the property. But any agreement would have to follow proper procedures and protect both sides. I explained that I was willing to have a conversation, but everything needed to be documented correctly. No more assumptions. No more relying on old stories or incomplete plans. During the discussion, another important issue came up. Some residents wondered if the HOA had a responsibility to review other projects where property boundaries might have been misunderstood. That question created concern because it suggested the road issue might not be the only example of outdated information affecting community decisions. Melissa requested that the HOA conduct a broader review of their records, contracts, and historical documents. She wanted to make sure future boards would not repeat the same mistake. This was a major change from the beginning of the situation. At first, the HOA believed they were defending a right they already had. Now they were reviewing their own process and accepting that proper verification mattered. The community event eventually moved forward using a different access plan. Residents still enjoyed the gathering, and the neighborhood avoided a larger dispute. For me, the biggest victory was not proving someone wrong. It was seeing the facts finally become more important than assumptions. A few weeks later, Melissa contacted me with an update. The HOA had completed its internal review, and they had discovered something unexpected in another set of old files. A previous board member had left a note about the original access issue, but that note had never been included in the official meeting records. The forgotten note contained a warning that could explain why the problem continued for so many years. And when I read what it said, I realized the road dispute had a much deeper history than anyone originally knew. The forgotten note from the previous HOA board became the final piece of information that connected everything together. When Melissa Carter sent me a copy, I immediately noticed why it had been important. The note was written by a former board member who had questioned the road access years earlier. It explained that the neighborhood had always relied on the assumption that the route was available, but there had never been official confirmation. The writer had recommended reviewing the property records before allowing continued use, but the recommendation was never placed on the main meeting agenda. The concern disappeared into old files, and the same misunderstanding continued for years. Reading that note changed the way I viewed the entire situation. The problem was not that someone suddenly decided to ignore my property rights. The problem was that a warning had been overlooked, and nobody followed up. That small moment from years earlier had created a chain of decisions that eventually affected everyone. Melissa admitted that the HOA should have handled the situation differently. She explained that new board members often depended on information from previous leaders, and when old assumptions were repeated enough times, they started to feel like facts. But official documents mattered more than memories. The HOA began making changes to prevent similar issues in the future. They created a process requiring board members to verify property boundaries, review legal documents, and confirm agreements before making decisions involving outside land. For me, that was the outcome I wanted from the beginning. I did not want conflict with my neighbors. I wanted clarity. A few weeks later, Melissa and I met again at the edge of my property. This time, the conversation was completely different. There was no disagreement about ownership. There was no assumption that the road belonged to the community. Instead, we discussed what a respectful solution would look like. The HOA decided to explore improvements to their own access route instead of depending on my farm. They also updated their community guidelines so future residents would understand the difference between shared spaces and private property. The residents who once believed the road was automatically available began seeing the situation differently. Many told me they never realized how much information could be missing behind a simple assumption. A road, a fence line, or a path might look obvious from the outside, but ownership depends on records, agreements, and legal boundaries. Looking back, the biggest surprise was not discovering that the HOA was wrong. The biggest surprise was discovering how easily an entire community could believe something without anyone checking the truth. But there was still one final step remaining. The HOA needed to decide whether they would formally recognize the mistake and create a permanent record explaining what happened. That decision would determine whether the same confusion could return years later. The final decision from the HOA became the moment when everyone understood what had truly happened. After months of confusion, the board officially documented the situation and acknowledged that the road across my farm had always remained private property. They created a record explaining the history of the misunderstanding, the missing agreements, and the steps they would take to prevent the same mistake from happening again. For me, that document represented more than a correction. It represented the importance of checking facts before making decisions that affect someone else's rights. When I first noticed vehicles crossing my land, I never expected the situation to become such a complicated issue. I thought it would be a simple conversation where someone would realize there had been a mistake. Instead, I discovered years of assumptions, incomplete information, and forgotten warnings that allowed the problem to continue. Melissa Carter also changed during the process. At the beginning, she was certain the HOA had the authority to use the route because that was what she had been told. But when the documents showed something different, she was willing to review the evidence and accept responsibility. That was the part one respected most. The situation did not end because one side defeated the other. It ended because the truth became more important than anyone's pride. The HOA eventually completed improvements to their own community access route, and residents no longer depended on my farm for a shortcut. The neighborhood event that originally created the urgency became a reminder of how important proper planning and communication really were. After everything was resolved, several neighbors stopped by to talk with me. Many admitted they had never considered how complicated property boundaries could be. They had assumed that if people used the path for many years, there must have been a legal reason behind it. But the reality was different. Usage does not automatically create ownership. Memories do not replace agreements. And assumptions do not replace records. Looking back, I learned that protecting your property does not always mean creating conflict. Sometimes it means staying calm, collecting information, and allowing the facts to speak. The entire situation could have become a long dispute, but careful research and honest conversations created a better outcome for everyone involved. Melissa later told me that the HOA had changed how they reviewed future projects. Every major decision involving property boundaries would now require official documentation before moving forward. That single change was the real result of everything that happened. My farm remained mine, the HOA learned an important lesson, and the community became more careful about respecting ownership rights. The road that caused so much confusion was never the biggest issue. The real lesson was that even a simple assumption can grow into a major problem when nobody takes the time to verify the truth. And sometimes, the strongest response is not an argument. It is having the right evidence when the moment finally comes.